This week, we have all seen images of Russian tanks and Russian soldiers making their way into Ukraine. We've seen images of mushroom clouds billowing up over neighborhoods. We've heard reports about why Ukraine is so important to Russia and so important to Europe and so important to our global network of peace. Wrapped up in this conflict that we've been witnessing this week is a lot of history. Russia and Ukraine have long been in fierce competition for certain pieces of land and control of certain people. Wrapped up in this conflict is technology. Ukraine once had one of the world's largest nuclear arsenals, but after guarantees from both the U.S. and Russia, decided to disarm. And now Russia invades Ukraine with their nuclear arsenal looming behind their soldiers. Wrapped up in this conflict is propaganda. As this week began, early in the week, every news source that I looked at had stories about the different ways that Russia were inventing stories to justify their invasion. Wrapped up in this conflict are resources and economics. Ukraine is a huge country that's rich in natural resources. And wrapped up in this conflict are people. There are people that are executing orders and people that are giving orders, and there are people that are creating reasons to fight and people that are trying to stop the fight. There are people that are reporting on this conflict and there are people that are lying about it. There are people that have died. There are people that have lost their loved ones, lost their homes, lost food, lost security, lost safety. Some have lost their humanity. Many have lost everything that they've known and have to live with the pain of their own survival as they begin a long road of evacuation, leaving behind a land and a place that they have always called home. There are even people wrapped up in this conflict that are half a world away, sitting in a rather comfortable church on a Sunday morning, wondering why this happens over and over again. Wondering what end does this serve, and wondering when it will end, and wondering where we end up when it all ends. Each of these people wonders, where is hope? Where can we find peace? What do we look to? Lurking behind the entirety of the biblical narrative is a backdrop of political conquest, political turmoil, political upheaval, and violence inflicted by the powerful on the weak. The people that have written the stories in this Bible that we read are people that have watched enemy armies come into their land and kill their people. They're people that have lost their cultural and their national identities at the hand of those more powerful than they. They're people that have been forced to evacuate their homes, sent marching to somewhere unknown, and leaving behind that which they have always called home. Think about the people that you've read about in these Bible stories that have been called or forced to leave their homes. Adam and Eve are cast from Eden. Abraham was called to leave the home of his father. Jacob fled from his home, from his mother and his brother and his dying father. Joseph, the son of Jacob, was sold into slavery in another nation. Joseph's brothers are forced to seek asylum because of a famine. Moses flees Egypt to spend 40 years in the wilderness, and when he returns, he brings an entire nation out to migrate through that wilderness for another 40 years. Ruth leaves her home and to join Naomi in a foreign land. David flees to the desert, and David's sons flee to those same deserts away from him. The entire northern kingdom is forced into exile by the Assyrians, and refugees from that northern kingdom flood into the southern kingdom, and then that southern kingdom is likewise cast into exile by the Babylonians. Another Joseph, who is the son of another Jacob, flees to Egypt, taking with him his wife and his newborn child named Jesus. And 70 years later, the temple would fall and the Christian and the Jewish communities would be dispersed into the nations and into exile. This story of exile, this story of forced migration, of being a stranger, a foreigner, of leaving home and going to a strange land floats in the backgrounds of every story in this collection of writings that we venerate. The word Hebrew, one of the names that's used to name the people of God, this word even means somebody that has crossed over, one who has left safety and security to venture into the unknown. Because this story of exile is the central story of this biblical witness, it's not surprising that the central question that people have within these stories over and over is the question of why. Why do the wicked prosper and the righteous perish? Why have we been forced from our homes? Why are we made to sing our songs in a strange land? Why have you, God, turned your face on us for so long? Why are we so God-forsaken? These are the questions that occupy this narrative. Some of the writers of this Bible seek to articulate these questions, to give voice to the dismay they feel at being the children of God and yet feeling so much trauma. Some of the writers attempt to answer these questions through historical narrative or theological exploration, and when they do, they offer reform so that maybe the future doesn't look like the past. And then there's some of these writers that give us poems and enactments that cry out against the powerful and give hope to the lowly. They hope that these words would change hearts and minds and actions and provide a vision for a future where something new is possible. And our text today comes from one of these poet prophets. Tucked towards the back end of our Old Testament is a short work by the prophet Habakkuk. Everybody say Habakkuk. Habakkuk. It's not a name that we recite often. Other than that, he wrote this work of 3 chapters. We don't know much about this prophet. We don't know where he was from, where he lived, where he died. He's not mentioned anywhere else in our Protestant Bibles. All we really know is that he was identified as a prophet and that historically he probably worked sometime right before or right after the Babylonian conquest of Judah. What makes Habakkuk's work somewhat unique in the prophetic writings is that it's portrayed as a conversation between God and the prophet. Most of the time, the prophet speaks on behalf of God to the people of Israel and acts as an intermediary for them. But in this book, there are just 2 subjects, the prophet and God speaking back and forth. In this book, the prophet gets to ask this question, why, directly to God, and then receives God's response. The surprise in this book is that God's response is not very satisfying. First, Habakkuk asks God why he takes so long to bring justice to the people of Israel. Not only is Babylon looming on the horizon, but the kings of Judah are corrupt, they're selfish, and they're inept. They seek political gain at the cost of the lives of their people. How long, O Lord, must I cry for help and you don't listen, says Habakkuk. Those with power do violence to those without, and yet you, God, do not save. The wicked surround the righteous, and the courts contain no justice. How long? And then God responds. Look and see, says God, for justice is coming your way. See, I am rousing the Babylonians against your kings. They will tear down this nation, and justice will be the fruit of their conquest. According to this prophet, God's answer to violence is that more violence will come. As you might expect, the prophet does not like this answer. Like Moses before him arguing for the lives of the people of Israel, and like Abraham before him arguing for the lives of Sodom and Gomorrah, Habakkuk argues with God. God, your eyes are too pure to look on evil, and yet you will send the treacherous on us? You'll be silent as the wicked swallow those more righteous than they. Babylon are fishers of men. They stab us with their hooks, and they catch us in their nets, and they rejoice in their bounty, and that bounty is us. Are you going to let them continue to take their fill, to grow rich, destroying nations without mercy? I will not depart my post, God, until you respond to this question. God's answer to this second round of questioning is no more satisfying than the first. He doesn't call off the wolves. He doesn't say that Babylon won't come. He doesn't say that the people of Judah won't suffer. He says instead that even in the suffering, justice will be found. Even as the Babylonians pay out justice on the powerful of Judah, they will receive the same judgment. The second part of this conversation ends with God giving a series of taunts that are meant to mock those that seek to gain and maintain power, the kings of Judah and the kings of Babylon. God says, do not those that gather the spoils of war become the spoils of war. Will not your own creditors come for you? Will not the blood that you have shed your own blood? Even though you've set your house on high for protection, the very stones of your home cries out for justice. You'll find that the violence that you do to the poor and the oppressed will be returned, and those that exploit the poor will become exploited. Echoes of this passage can be heard in Jesus' words several centuries later when he says that those who live by the sword will die by the sword. I don't know that if I am that prophet, that this is the answer that I would be looking for. I'd want an answer that says that justice will be delivered at no cost to myself, at no cost to my people. An answer that vindicates my righteousness and casts judgment on the wicked around me. But this is not the answer that Habakkuk receives. What I think this answer does do, though, is help the prophet to see that even though he's not on the throne, he is a participant in this kingdom of oppression, this kingdom that was never intended to start in the first place. And it's this kingdom that must be dismantled. What this answer does is help him to know that even in the dismantling of the kingdom, the people will be free. The third chapter that this prophet writes is a psalm. It's introduced as a song, as a poem, something that's meant to be sung. And there's three parts to this song. In the first part, the prophet asks God to show him the works that have made him worth worshiping in the first place. The final request of the prophet is this: once again, the enemy is bearing down on me. I have heard that you have set people free before. Can you still set us free? It's in the second part of this poem that the prophet truly receives his vision. Verses 3 through 15 contain a vivid description of God as a mighty warrior coming from the east to defeat his enemies and to set everything right in the created order. This vision is one of the most graphic depictions of a God fully embracing his wrath in an act of judgment. But in this vision, God's wrath is not aimed over people breaking simple rules. God's wrath is not aimed at just punishing immorality or idolatry. God's wrath in this story is about setting people free. God's wrath is about liberation. It's about scattering the proud and gathering the hungry. God's wrath is about removing mighty people from their thrones and bringing those that have been humiliated back up. God's wrath restores the cosmos that comes when people grasp at power. God's wrath gives dignity to those that have lost it. And so here we finally come to the scripture reading for today. This is Habakkuk's response to this final vision that he receives. And we read today this third part of the poem, the final words of the prophet Habakkuk. I hear and I tremble within. My lips quiver at the sound. Rottenness enters my bones and my steps tremble beneath me. I wait quietly for the day of calamity to come upon the people who attack us. Though the fig tree does not blossom and no fruit is on the vines, though the produce of the olive fails and the fields yield no food, though the flock is cut off from the fold and there is no herd in the stalls, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will exult in the God of my salvation. God, the Lord, is my strength. He makes my feet like the feet of a deer and makes me tread upon the heights. This is the story of God told for you, the people of God. Thanks be to God. The prophet trembles. His lips quiver. How could he not tremble at such a vision? He's a victim of a corrupt government, and his people face the wrath of Babylon, but this prophet has seen the wrath of God, and this wrath somehow gives the prophet hope. I watched a heartbreaking video this week of an interview with a Ukrainian woman who was taking shelter in a subway station, hoping that the missiles that she had been running from throughout the night would not penetrate the earth. These are some of the words that this woman said. It's like you wake up to a new reality at 5 a.m. and the world is no longer the safe place that you imagined. It's hard to believe that it is our neighbor doing this. We never believed that our neighbor could just come and rape our land and tell us what to do. It's hard to believe that it's happening. They have taken our neighborhood and we are not safe. At the beginning of the service, Pastor Dinah read to us the words of Mary's Magnificat. This week, I've learned that Mary's song is a lot like Habakkuk's song. God's full desire for the cosmos is expressed in Mary's song, and when that desire is frustrated, the world sees the wrath of God. God's full expression of salvation is announced in Mary's song. Salvation comes because the divine has migrated. The divine has left home in the heavens and crossed over. The divine has made himself an exile in solidarity with humanity in Jesus the Christ. My prayer this week is that somehow this woman and the people that surround her find the hope that Habakkuk found. My prayer is that all of those people that are facing exile today would know that the God of exile is with them. That the God of exile has acted in the past for freedom and for liberation. My prayer is that God's desire for shalom overwhelms those that are grasping for power. That the proud would be scattered, that the mighty would be torn from their thrones. That these humiliated would be lifted up once again. Every week in this service, we say the words, love your neighbor as yourself. These words are initially found in the 19th chapter of Leviticus. In just a few verses after these words, we find these. When an alien resides with you in your land, you shall not oppress the alien. The alien who resides with you shall be to you as the citizen among you. You shall love the alien as yourself because you were aliens in the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. The Hebrew word that's translated as alien here is the word ger. It's hard to translate this word into simply one English word. Wrapped up in this word are several experiences that come throughout the biblical narrative. This word ger is somebody that has left their home. A ger is a migrant. A ger is somebody that seeks safety and seeks asylum in new lands. A ger is a refugee, a resident alien, a foreigner in a foreign land, a stranger. A ger is an exile. Our world is way too good at making people into gers. Our world is way too good at making migrants, making refugees, making exiles, making asylum seekers. What we can do here today to respond to the making of all of these new gers half a world away is to learn to love them. Our closing prayer today was written by a man who migrated here from Vietnam when he was 4 years old with his parents. His name is Phuc Lu, and he's a biblical teacher in Houston now. Will you please pray this prayer with me? Migratory God, who uprooted Abraham and led him into a foreign land, provide rest for your people, the stranger and alien, the refugee and wanderer, the one seeking sanctuary, settling in an unfamiliar place. Migratory God, who travels great distances to become human and live among us, dwelling in us. Help us see that we are restless, searching and seeking, finding that place of being and belonging to lay our heads, as you who had no place except with your people. Migratory God, who has crossed borders and boundaries to be born a stranger, fleeing from country to country, feet moving for miles over desert and dry places into the Jordan River, where you cross from one land to the other in the waters of baptism, where you wash off ties to nation and citizen, so we might enter into a new kingdom and a new country. Migratory God, who accompanies us in our journey, remind us of where we've been, from where we've come, so we might not forget that we all traversed great distances to find the place that our hearts seek to settle, that place all of us call home. Amen.